Also breaking at this hour, news out of the White House. President Trump announcing new tariffs on Truth Social. The president posting that he will impose a 50% tariff on all kitchen cabinets, bathroom vanities, starting on October 1st.
The president this morning threatening, quote, substantial tariffs on any country that doesn't make its furniture in the United States. It comes just days after he announced plans to impose a 30% tariff on upholstered furniture and a 50% tariff on all kitchen cabinets and bathroom vanities.
President Trump will impose a new round of tariffs on imported heavy-duty trucks, branded medications, kitchen cabinets, and upholstered furniture. Trump announced the change will take effect on October 1st, writing on Truth Social last night that the large-scale flooding of the products into the U.S. by other countries is unfair to local manufacturers.
It started with a post. One of those early morning declarations that now seem to define the rhythm of American policymaking. Just a few lines long, typed in haste and confidence, it was enough to send shockwaves through industries that touch nearly every American home. The president announced new tariffs, 50% on trucks, 30% on upholstered furniture, heavy duties on kitchen cabinets, and even certain medications. To his supporters, it sounded like strength. To his critics, it sounded like chaos. By noon, markets were already reacting. Retailers' stocks dipped. Builders hesitated on orders. Importers called suppliers, desperate for clarity. But clarity never came. These weren't just numbers. These were choices that would ripple through millions of households, businesses, and even diplomatic relationships. The United States, once the champion of open trade and predictable rules, was now wielding tariffs like weapons. The official line was simple: rebuild American manufacturing, punish foreign freeloaders, and revive jobs. But as the days passed, the reality turned darker. Uncertainty began to replace optimism, and allies began to look elsewhere. For many, this was the moment they realized America's trade policy was no longer about partnership, it was about pressure. The furniture tariff became the symbol of that new era, a shock designed to jolt the system, but ending up shaking trust instead. Because what's really behind that 30% tariff on imported furniture isn't just wood and fabric. It's a test of how far economic nationalism can go before it begins to backfire. Inside showrooms from Atlanta to Los Angeles, retailers faced a sudden math problem they couldn't solve. Shipping containers filled with furniture from Canada, Vietnam, and Mexico were now too expensive to bring in. Suppliers froze new orders. Smaller family-run stores, already struggling after inflation, had no way to absorb the costs. It's not just the prices, one retailer said, it's the uncertainty. We can't plan next month, let alone next quarter. What was sold to the public as a push for American jobs quickly started to look like a slow bleed for American consumers. The irony was almost painful. The very industries the policy claimed to protect were built on international supply chains. American furniture brands rely heavily on Canadian lumber, Mexican assembly, and Asian textiles. Each tariffed border cut one more thread from that web, and soon the entire structure began to fray. And just as the tariff debate raged, something even more dramatic unfolded: the human cost of enforcement. In Georgia, federal agents detained hundreds of South Korean technicians working on a major battery plant project. These weren't illegal migrants, they were engineers, specialists brought in under legal visas to help complete a billion-dollar electric vehicle facility. The images were startling. Families escorted out of dormitories, buses lined up outside the plant, confusion and panic spreading through the community. Seoul's reaction was swift and furious. The South Korean government demanded an explanation, calling it a breach of trust between allies. For local workers, it was equally devastating. "These were our partners," one line worker said. "We were building something together." Within days, the project halted. Equipment sat idle. The cost of delay, hundreds of millions of dollars, piled up. And what was once hailed as proof of America's manufacturing revival now stood as a symbol of unpredictability. Investors in Seoul, Tokyo, and Berlin took notice. "If it can happen to Hyundai," one analyst remarked, "it can happen to anyone." The pattern was becoming hard to ignore. Big rhetoric, tough enforcement, but little follow-through. The Georgia raid wasn't an isolated story. It was part of a broader climate of fear and uncertainty spreading across industries. It wasn't just about border control anymore. It was about trust. Companies that once saw America as the safest bet in the world were starting to hedge that bet. That unease grew even deeper when the clean energy sector, once a bright spot of bipartisan hope, was suddenly thrown into disarray. In Connecticut and Rhode Island, a $6 billion offshore wind project known as Revolution Wind, nearly 80% complete, was stopped cold by a federal order. Environmental assessments, regulatory reversals, and new trade restrictions all collided in a perfect storm of bureaucracy and politics. Hundreds of workers were sent home. State governments sued. This was supposed to power 350,000 homes, said one local official. Now it's powering frustration. The project's Danish investors warned that delays could jeopardize future U.S. clean energy funding. And the irony deepened. While Washington talked about energy independence, Canada quietly expanded its renewable grid, exporting record levels of electricity southward. According to the Canada Energy Regulator, power exports from provinces like Quebec and Manitoba had surged, precisely because American projects were stalling. Then came copper, the metal that silently powers everything from wind turbines to home wiring. As tariffs and export restrictions squeezed global supply chains, copper prices spiked. Thieves began targeting cables, scrapyards overflowed, and construction costs ballooned. Cities from Phoenix to Detroit reported spikes in copper thefts, with infrastructure repair bills running into tens of millions. "It's crazy," said a utility supervisor. "We're fighting crime that didn't exist before, because now the metal itself is worth more than the work it supports." What was meant as protectionist policy had become a real-world social cost. Theft, higher prices, slower projects. The story of copper became a microcosm of a larger truth. Tariffs don't just reshape trade, they reshape behavior, sometimes in desperate ways. While the United States wrestled with these self-inflicted shocks, Canada saw an opening. In Ottawa, policymakers moved swiftly to stabilize industries hit by U.S. tariffs. The government expanded tax credits for manufacturers, boosted support through Farm Credit Canada, and launched new trade missions to Europe and Asia. A major FCC report estimated that diversification opportunities could be worth up to $12 billion annually, a direct byproduct of America's tariff aggression. Canada wasn't fighting the fire, it was redirecting the heat. Provinces like Ontario and Quebec began marketing themselves as stable alternatives for production and logistics. "When your neighbor is unpredictable," said one Canadian economist, "you don't complain, you compete." That competition was working. Companies that once planned U.S. expansions began opening plants north of the border. German and South Korean firms shifted parts of their North American supply chains to Canada, drawn by predictability and policy consistency. Even American investors began to notice. The Toronto Stock Exchange quietly became one of the world's top destinations for renewable and industrial listings. What was meant to corner Canada had instead strengthened it. Economists started to weigh in. Independent studies from major universities and policy institutes confirmed what markets already suspected. Tariffs were reducing overall growth and fueling inflation. Manufacturing jobs showed short-lived gains followed by stagnation, while consumer prices rose faster than wages. One analysis found that the 2018 to 2025 tariff cycles cumulatively shaved 0.5% off GDP growth each year, effectively erasing the benefits they were supposed to deliver. Businesses complained not just about higher costs, but about unpredictability. "You can plan for taxes," one CEO said, "but you can't plan for whiplash." The message was clear. What looks like power in the headlines often feels like panic on the ground. And yet, even as these costs mounted, the administration doubled down. More tariffs, more enforcement, more promises to bring back jobs. But investors were no longer listening. They were watching. Watching the delays in Georgia. Watching the lawsuits in New England. Watching the furniture importers close shop. watching Canada, South Korea, and the EU quietly strengthen their own partnerships while Washington chased a mirage of industrial revival. The pattern was unmistakable. Unpredictability leads to hesitation, hesitation leads to flight, and flight leads to loss of investment, of influence, of trust. Behind the numbers were real people. The furniture worker in North Carolina now clocking half his usual hours because imported materials became unaffordable. The Korean engineer stuck in legal limbo after the Georgia raid. The Rhode Island welder waiting for a project that might never restart. These aren't abstract consequences. They're the cost of policy made in haste. And perhaps that's the real tragedy, the gap between promise and performance. The goal of rebuilding America's industrial base was noble. The tools, however, were blunt. Meanwhile, Canada's approach looked almost surgical by comparison. Instead of retaliating headline for headline, it moved quietly, adjusting export routes, negotiating small but strategic trade pacts, and investing heavily in domestic processing for critical minerals like nickel and lithium. While Washington imposed, Ottawa diversified. While the US fought its partners, Canada turned them into clients. It was a masterclass in economic adaptation. By mid-year, Canada's exports to Europe and Asia had surged, while its dependence on US markets dipped to a 15-year low. In policy circles, some even began calling it the Canadian pivot. What was intended as economic pressure had evolved into a geopolitical reshaping of North America, with Canada at the center. By year's end, analysts would look back on this tariff cycle as the turning point, not just for trade, but for credibility. And when historians trace the line between economic policy and geopolitical influence, they may see this as the moment America's greatest asset, its reliability, began to erode. Because once partners learn to work around you, they rarely come back. In the end, it's not about furniture, copper, or wind farms. It's about the idea of America, whether it's a partner or a pressure point. And if that idea fades, so too does its influence. The lesson is simple, but hard to learn. Stability attracts, chaos repels. And no amount of tariffs can change that. Thank you for watching. If you found this story revealing, make sure to subscribe to Traveling Vibes and stay with us for more deep investigations into how policy, power, and people intersect to shape our world today.